Hello and welcome to this video. Today I'm going to decorate this glass jar. This was originally a candy jar I got when I was very young, and as you can see it's decorated. This is actually glass paint, so it's not gonna come up easily, but I need to remove it at least from the glass to have a clean surface to work from. So I spent some time with this scratchy palette knife kind of thingy from my plotter, just going around and scratching all of it out of all of the nooks and crannies and grooves, which was a bit harder than it looks because all of these surfaces are rounded, and it definitely took a while longer than I expected, but this glass paint is not alcohol soluble or anything, so yeah. I kind of had to bite the bullet and to actually get it to a clean surface so I can work on it, do this. Once it was clean, I could finally start sculpting, and I chose epoxy sculpt because that means that this will immediately adhere to the glass without me having to actually glue the sculpted parts back on. And it's just an easier way of saving time and materials, and this will harden really quickly and nicely, and it will be nice to sculpt with simple things, so it's the ideal material for this. Now excuse the camera work, this jar is pretty large and my camera is having a hard time focusing. I cannot really move it away much further from my desk. So to have everything in focus that I'm working on, I have to kind of, pull things around a little bit and hope it works out. So if there's some more zoomed in areas and all that, I cannot really avoid that. Anyway, the design I wanted to make was a kind of mushroomy, foresty kind of vibe. So I actually started off by sculpting this mushroom head for the handle. I wanted to cover this weirdly knobby shape kind of thing from the beginning because this is a twist jar and it doesn't really need the top surface. So I thought it was the ideal place to actually add my first mushroom top. And then I just went around and made some stems. And I'm using just some plain old water to smooth these things out and blend them in. At this point the epoxy is quite fresh still, so it's quite mushy and it needs like a couple minutes, like about half an hour to an hour, to like dry where it's not as like soft anymore. But the problem with that is that in that stage it will not stick as well anymore most times. So I'm trying to work with it immediately, but if I was sculpting anything different I would actually go back in and try to smooth things out after a while, maybe to refine the shapes a bit more. But since it's supposed to be more organical and a bit more natural, I decided to not change anything and just roll with it, although it definitely stuck to everything way too much. I had a hard time sometimes getting it off my gloves and the sculpting tools, and things kept kind of bending over, especially the stems of the mushrooms. For the side of the glass I wanted to add these side hanging mushrooms. I have only looked at inspiration pictures, but I'm not gonna accurately sculpt them. I only want it to look like mushrooms. I don't really want to add all of the fine details because it's just meant to be a storage jar. So if it looks like something that's supposed to look like, then I'm quite happy with it. So these side tree growing mushrooms are gonna be very random. I'm trying to blend them in on the top and bottom a little bit so that the edges will not be rounded over and they will look like they're actually growing out of the glass. And I try to make them kind of reverse umbrella shape, I guess, so more flat on the top and rounded on the bottom. I'm just gonna place them all over. Once I'm happy with the top mushrooms, I'm also going back in with my sculpting tool and I'm just adding like a lot of tiny ridges into the epoxy just to make like the detailing of the like side growing mushrooms a little bit nicer. I tried with a knife too, but the cuts like weirdly pulled material off and I found that just using my sculpting tool was the easiest thing. And after a day of hardening, it's time to paint these. I'm going in with paint directly because I'm using like miniature model paints. This paint is a bit more sticky than normal acrylics. If I didn't have them, I would probably put down a base coat of gesso, but I know this paint and epoxy go very well together. Any like other surfaces that I would have like smoothed out more or anything, I would have probably still applied some gesso too. And all I'm doing is I'm going in with some brown paints and I'm gonna gradient it a little bit. So I'm starting up with this like leather brown paint. I'm going in with a lighter yellowish tone in the middle and blending it out towards the edges with a bit of a darker brown. Now it's really hard to see on camera how I blend these things. And that's just because the wet paint reflects too much, but I hope you can kind of get the gist of it. And it's very noticeable once the paint is dried that I'm actually blending all of these paints in. For the top I want a bit of color variation, so I went in with the basic brown that I used for the sides as a base coat first, and I'm just painting that all over as a starting point, but I want some, you know, other colors of mushrooms as well, so I'm gonna change the colors drastically. I just really like to have like the same base color for everything, so it gives like this warm undertone. And then I basically, while I waited for this to dry, went in and painted the undersides of the mushrooms that are on the glass. And they're just gonna get a white base coat. and just a little bit of like a wash to define the ridges that I sculpted a little. Once the top base coat has dried, I'm going in with 2 tones of red for some of the mushrooms. So I'm just basically laying down a lighter red, and then I'm going to blend it around the edges with a little bit of a darker tone. Again, it's really hard to see the differences while I'm painting this because of the reflections, but once it's dry it should be very obvious that there has been a gradient added to this. Afterwards, it was time to paint the brown gradiented mushrooms, and for those I wanted to do a reverse coloring thing, so I basically painted some mushrooms in a light cream tone and then blended it with some darker browns in the middles, just to have some variety in the types of mushrooms. Once all the tops were painted, I went in with some very fine brushes and white paint and just painted all of the stems that I could reach and all of the undersides. Throughout the video going forward you will notice that I missed one mushroom entirely, but I'm fixing that off camera because I noticed this way later. But it still worked out fine, even though I had to go in between all the other decoration I added later. And then I also wanted to use the same white to add some really nice white dots for the mushrooms that I chose to be the red color gradient. And I'm just using the back of my rounded brush for that. It works excellently. Any kind of dotting tool basically works, either a stick, a toothpick, but I prefer rounded surfaces. You just have to add a bit of fresh paint and be patient as to not smudge them, because these dots will have to be this rounded shape, will have to have a bit more paint that takes a little bit longer to dry. To give the decorations that I want to add next something to grip on, I'm using some matte varnish, and I'm making sure I'm applying this with very dry brushes, and I'm just stippling it on all around. This will not only give us surface to have paint and other things stick on, but it also will make the glass a bit more matte in those areas. And I'm just going around randomly. I'm not applying this to the whole glass, I just want some random spots around the mushrooms to be a little more foggy and be ready to take on some of the decorations. And then I'm also adding it all over the mushroom top surface. Technically the surface is pretty rough already from the glass paint. I just wanted to make sure that it can hold the glue and all that pretty well. And lastly, I'm also using this varnish to glaze over the mushrooms, but in this case I'm not stippling it on, I'm just painting it on, and that will help just to protect the paint a little bit more and make them look a little bit more shiny. And apparently I had some white paint that wasn't fully dry, so I had to go in and over that one mushroom and clean it up a couple of times. But, you know, it worked out. Things like that happen when you don't wait for things to properly dry and are a bit impatient. Then next up, it's finally time to add the greenery. I'm using some standard foam flocking, and I'm just using some basic craft glue first, undiluted as a base coat. This is there to like help the first few layers of this stick. And then I'm just sprinkling it on, shaking some of the excess off, and then I'm starting to press in a lot of the material, because when the first base coat, usually most of the things will fall off and not stick, but in pressing it on, like a lot of the material will hold a little bit more, and it will like soak up the glue a little bit more, since this is basically like a foam type flocking. And then I also added some random mossy spots in and around the mushrooms that I put on the glass. And this is mainly one of the reasons why I wanted to have the matte varnish as a grabbing point. Make sure the flocking on the lid holds in the long term, I mixed up some watered down glue, and I actually sprinkled the entire top of the greenery with some isopropyl alcohol. It is basically just to fill in the foam, and then when you add the glue it will like really soak in deeply into all the wet spots. If you have dry spots, you may use way more watered down glue to like actually seal it in. And this is just a trick that a lot of model builders use to like fixate a lot of like groundwork that they put on top, because you can basically just spritz this with isopropanol or any other quick like evaporating alcohol, and then add the watered down glue, and alcohol will just easily evaporate and leave the glue to dry, and it will like harden it without actually changing too much of the texture that you've applied. Once all of the flocking was dried, I basically went in with some very diluted brown paint as a wash, and I'm just like painting it on, especially all of the places that I added the matte varnish. And I'm just gonna let it dry a little bit, blend it out, and then after quite a while where I can make sure that the paint has been at least drying a little bit on the surface, I just dabble it off. I'm kind of doing the same shading wise on the surface of the like already slightly dried glue. You can still see it's a bit like milky, but the glue's dried enough that I can actually work with things and things will not fall off, but it will need quite a while to actually fully dry in this case, since there's quite a lot of flocking that has soaked up all of the wet glue. And then I decided to add some string, this is just some normal twine, to decorate the side of the lid, just to make it a bit more nicer than the metal. Now the glue will not stick the twine to the glass, it will just basically stick the twine to the twine itself. So basically this is not really held onto the metal lid at all. It is more the twine holding itself together, but it still is pretty sturdy. In some places it hopefully will stick, but it should be pretty easy to remove if one wants to. So to actually secure it, I make sure to like cover it in some more watered down glue, just to make sure all the fibers absorb it. And first of all, it will get rid of some of the stray fibers, which some of them I actually cut off in the end of the like really long ones, and it will also help, as I said, help the twine stick like together and really hold. And then while it's still wet, I'm watering down some of this brown paint, because I didn't really like the color of the twine too much, I wanted it to be darker. So I just went around while the glue was still slightly wet and just basically spread it around, and it gave a nice even color. At some spots where apparently I didn't get enough glue in to hold it along the rounded edge, so I added some more and just held it for a while until it was dry. And then lastly I just went in dabbling on some green paint with my finger in some spots and basically like wiping that off almost immediately, just to have it look a little more mossy on the outside of the glass. And with that, the stuff is basically finished. All I needed to do was fill in some more of the gaps, so I just used some more glue. As I said, I'm working on this while it's practically dry, so this won't disturb anything. But I'm just using some pure glue, filling anything in. This is also the point when I noticed that that one mushroom still didn't have a white base, so I painted it. And all I did, just, you know, fill in, and then I also wanted to shade it a bit, so I used some greens that are washed out and just dabbled them on, and that's basically my project here done. I honestly thoroughly enjoyed decorating this glass. The sculpting was pretty simple, but overall the decoration of it took quite a while, as you can see by the length of the video. I actually didn't want to cut out too much because I thought it was quite satisfying to watch everything come together, and it just looks so adorable. As I said, the epoxy just adheres really well on the sides. I didn't have to add any glues, and all of the details of like the shading and stuff really give it an interesting vibe, and it still works really well as a normal glass. I can put in candies or anything else I really want, and it just will look a bit nicer on the bookshelf. I especially love how the top looks like a tiny mushroom garden with all the greenery around and the tiny mushrooms growing out of it. I think the variety of them definitely worked out really well, and it looks super adorable. And again, it was super easy, just a bit time consuming to wait for everything to dry. So if you have a glass laying around and maybe you have some epoxy sculpt, I'm sure you can also use other clays and just have to adhere them on with some strong glue that can adhere to glass. Maybe pick it up and try decorating a glass for yourself. And of course it doesn't have to be mushroom themed, you can theme it any whichever way you want and just have a nice, personalized decoration or presentation item in your room that is definitely gonna look nicer than the plain thing. No shame though if you really like the plain look of the glass. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed me making this project. Let me know in the comments down below if you had a glass like this, what would you decorate it with? And as always, I hope you have a great day. See you next time, bye bye!